to articulate them in our conversations with others. Help us to be winsome. Help us to stand firm on your word, because we know it's sure. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Last time we got together, we were starting to get into randomness. And I thought Josh had a really good thing about that. As we get into this issue of randomness, chaos, if you will, God is a God of order, not randomness, for sure. So we're going to pick this up right here, and we will move forward.
That makes sense. There's nothing there. Why? That is what randomness means. Randomness means that there is nothing intelligent here. It is purely random, purely chance. Now, the problem is that there is a lot of order there already. Well, what I'd like for you to do is take a look at a clip from an incredible video that has been produced, and one that I think you will find fascinating. We're going to look at several clips of it today. Unlocking the Mysteries of Life. And they're talking about this issue of chance and order. Let's look at it.
By the 1970s, most researchers had rejected the idea that the information necessary to build the first cell originated by chance alone. To understand why, consider the difficulty of generating just 2 lines of Shakespeare's play Hamlet by dropping Scrabble letters onto a tabletop. Then consider that the specific genetic instructions required to build the proteins in even the simplest one-celled organism would fill hundreds of pages of printed text.
Now, it's a short clip, but it's saying an awful lot there. Think about how long it would take for you to drop Scrabble letters on a table simply to come up with those 2 lines from Shakespeare. How long do you suppose it would take? Ashley, how long do you think it'd take you to drop letters on a table to finally get there?
I'd be gone before it happened.
You'd be gone. I think you're probably right. But do you know what? That example presupposes something. It presupposes that there are Scrabble letters with letters on it. Does it not? The way we really should look at this
and you have the letters
is that you have some...
Yeah, and that's a point I didn't even bring up last week, because that's an even bigger issue. You know, we're supposing that we're only working with the letters that we need.
Yeah, Chuck Misler had a good one on this. He like came in to give something. He had like these beads around his neck, and so he just started explaining. He's like, "Oh, this is the Genesis 1:1 in Morse code," and he's like, "I just dropped these beads randomly on the floor and picked them up, and it just happened to
be Genesis 1:1."
Genesis 1:1, and so he went into this whole spiel here. And
yeah,
it was a great example.
But the assumption of organized information in logic, right? An absolutely horrible assumption. It's a fallacy.
Yeah.
You're assuming that data and logic can be gathered together in the first place.
Yep. Yep.
It's a huge assumption.
Sure is.
It's the God telling the scientists to get their own dirt to make man again.
Boy, there's a way to phrase that.
And it's kind of like you can think of Paul Revere and his ride. There was a code to that, but you had to have what the code meant.
Yep. You had to have the key to the code.
You had to have the key to the code. So if you didn't know it was 2 by C,
Yep.
it's meaningless.
Yep.
So without somebody to establish the meaning of the code,
Without a code giver, without a log giver.
Good stuff.
Someone over in an earlier table with blank Scrabble squares and a paintbrush flicking paint on those squares trying to get a letter. How long would it take, Ashley, to sprinkle ink on these letters until you finally get one letter?
A long time.
We would all be gone for sure. And then you finally get one letter, and that goes over to the table that we're going to finally build our letters of Scrabble letters that we're going to drop on the table to get 2 lines of Shakespeare. Do you understand that this is one of the fundamental issues that is becoming a difficult question to answer, and that is, where does this organized information come from? The impossibility of that is what Wald says, well, yeah, I know it's impossible, but just mix in enough time and it all becomes possible. It's like the magic wand. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Well, what do we really hear when we look at the cosmos, when we really listen to it? What is it that it says to us? Several years ago, a man by the name of David Breese wrote a book entitled 7 Men Who Rule the World from the Grave.
This is a very interesting list. I remember in school, Dewey being praised. Yep, being praised. Darwin, of course. Some of these others, Marx and Freud, probably the only other 2 that are even known by name.
Keynes, he's got the bad economic theories that a lot of people seem to.
Theology. And so how did Dewey affect the church?
I don't even remember.
Segregated classes by age.
Wow.
That's something that we took. We ultimately took segregation by age, partly from the school system.
Which is,
And it's actually interesting, that the whole history is interesting. He went back, he looked at who lost and who they lost to. It was a Prussian, it was a critical theory coming out of Prussian military theory. And it was a bad idea to start with, and then Americans ultimately picked it up.
what's interesting though with Dewey, with you bringing that out, it really falls in line with the kind of mental thinking that he had. How is it that we find books on a bookshelf? They're divided into categories, if you will. So very interesting there.
Alphabetical, Dewey. It's not that hard. Alphabetical. Put it in alphabetical order.
Yeah, but if you want it by subject,
I love it. Let's keep going here.
I don't know
The
who
list includes
I don't either.
7. We could add some more. But the point he's making is that this is what happens when men can change our worldview. Darwin, from my standpoint, is the foundation of that.
We had an interesting discussion on that after a podcast. We do a little segment. And I agree with that statement. I believe Darwin is probably the one that has had the greatest impact. You could make a case for Marx. You absolutely can make a case there. But there you go.
And that is why we're going to turn our attention to his theory. Because it is one of the primary theories that has been used to persuade people that we really don't need a God. It's one of the most influential theories in modern civilization, and we're going to take the time to examine it and ask ourselves, does it really match reality? Now, we have to do a little work here first, because it's important for us to understand when we're talking about science, that we understand what we mean when we talk about 3 words: hypothesis, theory, and law. What are they? Let me give you just a brief, very brief example. And it may seem very simplistic, and it will be. Let's suppose that this represents reality. This is what is really real in the box. How does science approach trying to develop the truth claims about the particulars in the box. Normally, we begin with what we call a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a very early assumption based upon some limited looks into the box. Basic data. We build an early assumption that will allow us to begin to further investigate. If you investigate long enough and you examine the stuff in the box and it begins to confirm that hypothesis, we then move to a theory. And a theory is much more sophisticated because a theory now begins to predict, based upon its theory, that when you reach down into the box at a particular place in a particular time, you will get data which supports that theory. Kepler, for example, and others have given us the truth claim about the orbits of bodies around the Earth and around the Sun and so forth, that we can predict that if we launch a rocket in this direction at this velocity, we will be able to land on the moon, not on Pluto. So a theory is one that allows us to begin to predict that the data in reality will match what our truth claim says. Eventually, we might work our way to the declaration of a law. And a law is a truth claim that is very broad, that says no matter where you reach within this realm, the reaches of the law, you will find this to be true, this to be true, this to be true. The data will match that law. Now, what happens if we have an assumption, a hypothesis, and we are gathering data, and all of a sudden that data doesn't match the hypothesis? What do we do, Jason?
We throw it out. If it's wrong, or change the hypothesis.
Well, yeah, we throw it out or we change it.
You're supposed to.
Why?
Because it's obviously a bad hypothesis.
And why is it a bad hypothesis?
Because it didn't give you the proper data when you...
It doesn't match reality.
Right.
Correct? So, let's suppose we've now moved to a theory. And we have a theory that has gone through that stage. And we are now to the point where we can predict data. And we predict and say, when you reach into reality here, you're going to find a yellow ball. And we get a green triangle. What happens?
Well, you check your testing, and then you go back to the hypothesis, because obviously your theory's bad.
That's right. First of all, you say, well, did we reach into the right place in reality and da-da-da? But let's suppose we did, and we pull out a green triangle. We go back and say, we've got something wrong with the theory. That's exactly what science does. Well, it's important for us to recognize that because we have to deal with these words. And in particular, we have to deal with the word of theory. That's what we're going to do. We're going to examine Darwinian evolution, and we're going to ask ourselves whether or not this theory does match reality. How does it stack up against reality? We have some incredible statements about this theory. Huxley said, Darwin's theory is no longer a theory, but a fact. Darwinianism has come of age, so to speak. We are no longer having to bother about establishing the fact of evolution. What is Huxley saying about this theory?
That's exactly what he's saying. He's calling it a law. Now the problem is, can he use that word? No. That's a problem.
Now, he doesn't want to use the term law because that implies something very serious in the scientific language. But he's willing to call it a fact. Asimov, today, although many educators play it safe by calling evolutionary ideas theory instead of fact, there is no reputable biologist who doubts that species, including Homo sapiens, have developed with time and that they are continually, though slowly, changing.
Notice the term reputable.
Who defines that?
Yeah, that's That's the sad part, and that's why words matter. Because when you make arguments like this, you've got to make sure that everybody is working off the same definitions. Otherwise, the other side is going to change up the meanings.
Well, why don't you believe me? I'm telling you that your worldview doesn't fit reality because you're not reputable. Why am I not reputable? Because I don't believe you.
Yeah.
Because I'm not reputable. Yeah. Why? Because you don't believe me. Oh.
Makes sense.
There's no consensus. Oh, consensus makes fact, right?
Interesting stuff here.
Carl Sagan, evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. Natural selection is a successful theory devised to explain the fact of evolution. Now, Dawkins even goes a little further. He says it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But I'd rather not consider that. Now, if you are disconnected with what's going on in academia today, you will not realize that Dawkins' perspective is a perspective that is carried by many professors in our universities. For those students who come into the class believing that God is the transcendent creator, they are soon led to believe that they should be considered ignorant or stupid or insane, maybe even possibly wicked. So here we have this consistent picture that evolutionary theory is a fact. And it's the assumption of virtually all school textbooks. This is my daughter's college biology textbook. Let me show you what it says about this theory. The theory of evolution is no less reliable than is the atomic theory or the germ theory of infectious disease. As with atoms, which cannot be directly observed, we cannot directly observe the production of new species by evolution. Biologists have gathered a tremendous amount of evidence in support of biological evolution, however. And not one major piece of evidence has ever been obtained that suggests that it has not occurred. Conversely, the so-called theory of creationism proposes no testable hypothesis and thus cannot be proven right or wrong. Proponents simply accept it on faith. The theory of evolution, however, suggests many projections that can be tested. Okay? This is an interesting statement by Dr. Berlinski. Let me just let you hear it to some extent in response to what we just saw in terms of the idea that, well, it's just these fundamentalist religious people who are opposing evolution.
The claim that all skeptics about Darwinian orthodoxy or Christian fundamentalists stands refuted by me. It's obviously not true. I'm neither a Christian nor a fundamentalist. But lots and lots of people are skeptical in the scientific community. I know dozens of mathematicians who scratch their head and say, you guys think this is the way life originated? It's absolutely a preposterous theory. And many, many very significant figures. John von Neumann, one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, just laughed at Darwinian theory. He hooted at it. So it's perfectly absurd. This is a point in a polemical dispute. It's not a reasonable standard of criticism.
Yeah.
Opposition to Darwinian theory is, I wouldn't say widespread, but there's a consistent group of people, among mathematicians, among physicists, among some very good speculative biologists, who simply don't accept it, don't even regard it as a scientific theory in any reasonable sense.
So, if this is back then, it's got to be growing more today. There's got to be more people that, because now they'll talk about intelligent design, which back then they weren't. But,
They're spiritual now.
yeah, but the problem is the public schools have invested so heavily, and the United States so heavily on evolution. How do you back down from that now?
That's true, but you're right. It's getting more and more laughable because, like I said, math, probability theory, if you work it out, the probability gets into absurdity. Even if you pretend universe is 4.5 billion years old, and you start breaking down the seconds available for these random occurrences to occur, there's not enough time. There's not even enough time in their 4.5 billion years. Last time we even talked about entropy, and you know, the whole thing with entropy, you know, these chemicals don't magically form together no matter how much time you have, because it's just not possible. Which they don't teach entropy in biology, because
Yep.
it's anathema.
Yep.
Because it proves this wrong every time. But they're starting to shift, and you know, they're going into this like space alien stuff as seeding
Yes.
life here on Earth. So to get a, you know, since they can't use Darwin to get around God anymore, they're now, you know, trying to say like some advanced space civilization came down
It's on Mars.
and seeded life on the planet. And that's where a lot of these university professors are going.
It
Yeah.
was on Mars for a while, right? Like, so you go back, remember we did this when we did that episode on aliens. We went back and we said, look at where the aliens came from. By the way, evolutionary theory started to posit that life might have been seeded from the moon, and then from Mars, and then from further on. There were people early on in the 1900s suggesting seeded life, because it was just starting to become it's like, wait a minute, we might need an escape mechanism.
Yep.
In the 90s, it went to like seeded life from far reaches of this galaxy, or where we can't see it, push the problem as far away as possible. And it's just getting worse. It's getting to be more and more
Yeah,
ludicrous.
because their space alien thing kind of avoids all the criticisms that their other thing gets.
Mhm.
Because now they can say, well, okay, yeah, all the scientific things hold, but it just came from space aliens.
It's like, okay, so where's your evidence? I have a resurrected Jesus Christ of Nazareth who, died, was buried, resurrected, and I've got an intradimensional being that I have historical evidence of. People saw him, people reacted. You have undefined space aliens. What? And you accuse me of the spaghetti monster, fallacy of just saying it's just something out there that doesn't exist.
Let's keep going.
The theory is in trouble. What is really true? What are we looking at? Now, about a year ago, I was watching my graduate school. I went to Auburn University. And they were playing in the Southeast Conference Championship football game, and they were playing against the Tennessee Volunteers. And as we were watching this game, it was an important game, critical game, championship game. It was a close game, and the Tennessee team was close to the goal line, and the Tennessee quarterback dropped back and threw a long pass, and one of the Tennessee receivers leaped out parallel to the ground and caught the ball just before it hit the ground, and immediately all the Tennessee players screamed with joy, and all the Tennessee fans jumped with joy. Touchdown! Except something strange happened. At that moment, the Auburn players all immediately said incomplete. And all the Auburn fans immediately said incomplete. Instantly. How is this possible? Was it a touchdown or was it not? Now, I was watching it, and I saw for certain that it was incomplete. The referees called it good, but they obviously missed the call. How is it that thousands of people immediately saw the same thing but concluded a different truth claim from it? Interesting, is it not? Well, what happens is that man has a tendency to see his own position. We need to be careful as well as Christians, that we don't simply just see what we want to see. Because quite frankly, folks, in this area of science, The data is pouring in. The deeper we look into space, the more close we look into the cell and everything else, the more we see and hear the heavens declare the glory of God. You and I do not need to be afraid to look into a telescope. We do not need to be afraid to look into the microscope. Because the evidence supports the truth of God. In fact, the more it pours in, the more there is developing a deep, troubling sense by those who see the universe as nothing but just a box. Now, there was a man who wrote a book in the 1800s, and his name was William Paley. An incredible man. And his book is titled Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. That's when titles were very long. But William Paley, in this book, spoke of an interesting opening scenario. And it goes something like this. He says, suppose a man was walking through the moors, let's say forest, and his foot happened to dislodge an object. He picked up the object and he began to examine it. And he noticed when he pushed the little thing here that the lid opened up. And inside he began to notice that there were numbers and a little small hand and a larger hand, and when he put it to his ear, he heard a ticking sound, and the more he observed it, he began to realize that it somehow kept time with the morning and the evening and the days. Now, William Paley said no one in their right mind would look at this and say, my goodness, look what the pine sap and the pine straw and the freezing and the thawing and the cold and the wind and maybe a little squirrel fur here or there have produced an amazing thing, don't you think? And Paley says no one would think that. Why? Because it is obvious to us that this is a pocket watch and it has been created by a watchmaker. It was called, and is still called, Paley's argument for design. Well, there was another book, you fast forward now, 200 years approximately, and there is now a book written by Richard Dawkins entitled The Blind Watchmaker. Dawkins is attempting to refute the old argument of Paley, which for years was put in the dustbin, but now because of the evidence is being revised. And so in his book called The Blind Watchmaker, he says this: natural selection, the blind unconscious automatic processes which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. Now, this is interesting because we are now coming to the point where it is getting more difficult to cover our ears, to close our eyes to this noisy universe. Look at this statement by Dawkins. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Do you understand what he's saying? I know it looks designed, I know it looks like it had a purpose, but it doesn't. Interesting statement. Now, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, brilliant man. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Can you imagine this? A student in Dr. Crick's class? Dr. Crick is saying, repeat after me. It was not designed. It was not designed. It was not designed. Why do you have to do that? Because it looks designed. Can you imagine if the forensic investigator or the insurance investigator coming upon the scene and saying, boy, it sure looks like arson to me, but no, we can't accept that argument. Well, sure looks to me like this guy was murdered, but no, we can't accept that. It has to be an accident. Do you understand what is happening here? The evidence points that someone started the fire. The evidence points that someone had a hand in this murder, but we will turn a blind eye to it. Why? Because we've shut ourselves off of anything outside the box. And so Dawkins and Crick and others are now in the mode of trying to convince us to say, look, repeat after me, it was not designed. It just appears that way. Well, you know what? It's really kind of silly, is it not? I don't know how many of you have driven by Mount Rushmore, but I guarantee you, people don't drive by Mount Rushmore and say, hey kids, look what the rain and the snow and the wind have done to this mountain here. Well, by golly, that looks a little like George Washington. And what a coincidence, right next to him is something that looks a little like Thomas Jefferson. No one would do that. How is it that we know that when we walk along the ground and someone discovers an arrowhead, that it's not just a weird-looking rock? We recognize design. It is obvious to us. In fact, it is plain to us. Why do we turn away from it? Charles Darwin said, I remember well the time when the thought of the eye made me cold all over. Why do you suppose the thought of the eye made Darwin cold all over?
Probability of it.
Because it doesn't work.
It doesn't fit. There is so much incredible design within the eye. He says, but I've got over the stage of the complaint, and now small, trifling particulars of structure often make me very uncomfortable. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Why did a peacock's feather make Darwin sick? Why do you suppose, Jay?
It's like someone actually designed it.
How did the peacock somehow create this feather with what looks like an eye on it? Oh, the heavens declare the glory of God. All you have to do is look. All you have to do is look, because it is plain to us.
Okay, that's part one. Thoughts?
Why are flowers beautiful? Bees are colorblind.
Why do we even have a aspect of beauty? Why is that? And why is some art objectively good and some art subjectively appreciated? Why are some things objectively beautiful?
You go on with like everyday things. Just, why is there men and women?
Yeah.
Why is sex enjoyable?
I love
Why is, those things don't just happen randomly.
Right.
It's impossible.
I love the way
Right.
that Lewis put it in The Great Divorce. I said this in the podcast. He had in the dialogue between the artist in hell and the friend in heaven, they're going back and forth, and the artist says, "Well, can I paint the landscape?" And the sojourner from heaven says, "No, your paintings will mean nothing. Before, in the world before, when you painted, what brought beauty and joy was a glimpse into this world, heaven. What you did then, what was beautiful, was only a shadow of what is before you to take. If you would would only take it. And I thought that was interesting. Every bit of inspiration for this positive is possibly just a glimpse into heaven that God was giving us through Sweet Dreams of the artist. Yeah. That was kind of cool.
It is. This is part 2.
Well, everywhere we look, we see this incredible complexity, this order, this harmony, that if you recall, Kepler was saying that is what science is all about. Science is involved in looking at this order and the harmony that God has created for us. But when we reject the designer, then you're left with this deep problem associated with the disconnect between a random chaotic box and all the order that we see, and the beauty and the grandeur that's associated with it. Well, we're going to look at a few of these. What do you suppose this is? Joshua, you know what this is. What is it?
It is a blood clot.
It is a blood clot. What are the red things there?
Red blood cells.
Red blood cells, that's exactly right. What are the white things, the white strands?
Oh, it's the called fibrin.
Yes, that's exactly right. They're strands of fibrin. I'm impressed. Blood clotting is an incredible thing. Have you ever thought about it? What an amazing thing God has given to us in this little system that we just ignore called the clotting of the blood. What do you think about this? I mean, what would happen? We get cut, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why don't we bleed to death? Actually, I've got a friend who can explain this a whole lot better than I do, and so I'm going to have her explain this for you.
I cut my finger this morning, and it's bleeding. But if I put this Band-Aid on, it'll stop in a while. Did you ever wonder how it happens? I mean, does blood just stop because that's what it's supposed to do? Why doesn't our blood clot before we get cut? I guess we just died then, because all our blood would harden up and stop flowing. Did you ever wonder why? Blood clotting is a very complex process involving thousands and millions of triggers that have to act just perfectly with one another to create the final outcome. Let me see if I can tell you how this works. First, you get a little cut like mine. Imagine you're in my bloodstream. There's a bunch of traffic going on. In return, you're floating around a cajillion other red blood cells, all with oxygen backpacks. Everything slows down when you get into the cut. This is called vascular constriction. In short, your body limits the flow near the cut because it knows something is wrong. And of course, you feel pain. So, a protein in your body called fibrinogen arrives on scene. Fibrinogen is primarily responsible for stimulating platelet clumping, essentially cuts off the ends of the fibrinogen. Platelets form by binding to collagen. Upon activation, platelets release adenosine 5-diphosphate, ADP, and TXA2, which activate additional platelets, serotonin, phospholipids, other proteins, and other important proteins for the coagulation cascade. Activated platelets change their shape to accommodate the formation of a plaque. Oh, sorry, I digress. Anywho, this complex thing called the Stewart factor converts prothrombin to thrombin, thereby converting fibrinogen to fibrin. By the way, the Stewart factor wasn't active until it was activated by the Christmas factor. Okay, there's a lot more to this process. Like this goes there, binding, recepting, who knows what. It's very complicated. But the net result is a clot. Stops the bleeding, cut heals, clot dissolves, you're on your way. Isn't that neat?
Isn't this an amazing system? Now, how long do you suppose that we took in our evolutionary process before we finally got the clotting system right?
Well, people would die, right?
So that actually brings up a really good question there. Would it not be probable that whatever animal species you're talking about would die off?
This is the least of the issues. You just imagine just the pure carnage it would have taken, the progressive carnage of time it would have taken with all these animals that would have died without a digestive system. That would have died
Yep.
And I'm saying that, and even that doesn't make sense because they would never have gotten off the ground. They would have never formed.
That's true.
The irreducible complexity of the body is so in itself complex that, that's.
Yep.
Yeah, it's impossible.
Kind of like insane.
How long do you suppose we could last without a clotting system? Not very long. And especially the many generations it would take for us somehow to figure out all those factors. Do you know what happens when one of those doesn't work?
You bleed out.
Hemophilia is a result of one of those factors not working. What an incredible thing that God has given to us in blood clotting, which we probably just ignore because we expect it to happen. Okay, let's examine this reality then. Let's begin to look at Carl Sagan's statement. And we'll take his statement as the outline from which we're going to examine this theory. Sagan said that evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. Well, if that's the case, if the fossil record and contemporary molecular biology are two things that demonstrate and support the fact of evolution, then let's simply take a look at those and see what reality says. We'll begin with molecular biology, and then we'll talk about the fossil record. What we're going to do is, first of all, begin with Charles Darwin's own statements about his theory. What it is that he laid out as the criteria by which one could reject his theory. Let's look at this first one. Darwin stated, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Do you understand the criteria he's laying out there? Because if gradual Darwinianism, his theory that said over a long period of time, organisms have these very slight changes, these very slight modifications, and that is what has led to the deep complexity that we see today. So what he is saying, he said, if you can demonstrate that there is a complex organ that could not have come into being by that slow, gradual process, then he said, my theory would absolutely break down. So let's take a look at that. We're going to ask Dr. Meyer again to examine part of the reality that exists when we take a look at Darwin's time and his theory, what he was saying in terms of what we're seeing today.
In the 19th century, biologists thought that cells were simple, homogeneous globules of plasma. Now, with that kind of understanding of life, it was easy to imagine how life might have arisen through a few simple chemical reactions, and the origin of life was no big problem. Post-1953, with the discovery of the structure of DNA and also the information-bearing properties of DNA, we can no longer look at the cell the same way. And what we're now discovering is that the cell is chock full of exquisite miniature machines, little turbines, little rotary engines, little walking robots that cart materials from one end of the cell to another. Now, in our experience, all of those kinds of entities
are produced by one cause and only one cause, and that is intelligence. And that again challenges materialism, because the materialistic worldview of the 19th century said there's two fundamental realities, matter and energy. What we're now discovering is that there's a third fundamental reality, and that is information. And everything we know about information is that it must come from an intelligent cause. So the presence of information in living systems suggests an intelligence that pre-exists us, that is responsible for all that exquisite nanotechnology information.
Okay, so what Dr. Meyer is talking about here is this idea that what has happened in terms of the technology that we have now is that we have begun to take a look at that inner cell. Remember Paley's argument. If, he said, you were to find a machine, a complex machine, such as a pocket watch, you would understand instantly, you would know, it's plain to you, that what you have in your hand is not something that has just gradually come about as a result of some natural force. It's very clear to you. This has some sort of a design, and it carries a purpose. Now, as Dr. Meyer was saying, in Darwin's time, the cell appeared to be a hidden little black box. It wasn't a machine, it was just some little living glob, and somehow it had the potential within it to be able to mutate and to change. But what we have today is the technology to actually look inside that cell. And what we find is incredible. We're going to return to unlocking the mysteries of life and look at what that inner cell looks like and the machinery and the incredible magnificence of what is going on inside that cell. Now, what I want you also to notice is that at the end of this, there will be a man by the name of Dr. Dean Kenyon, and he will be making a statement as the result of seeing this complexity. And in order for you to understand the importance of this man's statement, you need to understand that for years and years, Dr. Kenyon was one of the leading scientists and proponents of his theory in trying to describe how the molecular structures and everything comes together. He was the proponent of a theory called chemical evolution. And you might be interested to see his statement about the grandeur of what is now to be seen within the living cell.
In the years since Kenyon's rejection of chemical evolution, science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
What an amazing thing going on inside every living cell. The gentleman at the end, Dr. Kenyon, beholding the reality of what was going on within the cell, recognizing that his own theory, faced with the reality of the deep complexity, he used to believe for years and years that there had to be some random process there because there couldn't be a creator. And so his theory that some chemical attraction would bring all those things together. The more he began to look at the cell and the complexity, he realized that was impossible. And now that we understand what is really going on inside there, Dr. Kenyon recognizes and understands that this is the result of intelligent designer. That's the way we should respond. When we gaze into the box, when we gaze and see the plain evidence that God has given to us. You know, the problem is that doesn't always happen. Man doesn't always accede to the reality of what is plain to them. Dr. Francis Crick, a brilliant man, the co-discoverer of DNA, when he began to gaze into the cell and began to understand the deep complexities of what we have there. In fact, if you really want to understand how complex this issue is, it has been stated that just for the single amoeba, the information that is found within the amoeba to provide all of the DNA structure would fill 1,000 sets of Encyclopedia Britannicas. Amazing complexity. So when Dr. Francis Crick is peering into the microscope, and it is beginning to dawn on him the deep complexity of what we see here at the fundamental level of life, he becomes convinced that this could not have happened by chance. He says an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. So what does Dr. Crick do? Does he then turn to the reality of a creator? No. He then proposes a theory, a little modification of earlier theory, but his theory is directed against for me. The theory that the first living cell must have been transported to the Earth from some other planet outside our solar system.
Now, what What is the problem even with that?
Where did that come from?
Thank you.
Where did information come in the first place? You kicked the whole thing down the road.
Yep. All you did was push it out.
But you're not roughing it. But you're not roughing
But that's what they do, because at least if they move it out to space aliens or whatever, you know,
They don't have, then they don't have to answer questions.
they don't have to answer any questions or anything else. Matter of fact, they gotta have like more faith than we do. Because they've got nothing to base it on.
Yeah.
I love the way you
They've got
said it.
absolutely nothing to base it on.
I love the way you said it. There's not enough time in it's 14 and a half or 17 billion, somewhere in there now is what the estimate is.
I thought it was 69.
Billion?
Yeah. But
Did they extend it out further?
I don't know if it's been quote unquote officially.
Okay. Well, even in that level, after you consider the amount of failures that would have happened to the genetic, to the genomes that we see on this earth, there would have been a huge amount of dead and failed fossils that were clearly failed evolutionary work.
Yep.
That just crumpled, and you don't have enough time. Not only do you not have the evidence of it, but you don't have enough time, even in 4.5 billion years, for that many random accidents to occur. You're looking at like the monkey theorem. I don't think did they talk about the monkey
I
theorem?
don't know. No,
You're familiar with the monkey theorem?
I am not.
If you have a billion or a trillion monkeys that have a trillion typewriters.
Oh,
It's similar.
yes. I'm sorry. I do.
It would take a trillion times as long as the estimate of the universe to come up with to be or not to be. After you consider the
Yep.
colon and a few factors, it's this huge astronomical level. At the typing level, at the typing rate they would be going, it's 1 in like 150 billion in a chance. But you got to take that chance and stretch it out over time, and
Yep.
it's trillions of years.
You know, there's a whole industry that bets against this, that life just randomly appears. You know, when you go grocery shopping, there's a whole food preservative industry that's betting that random life and, the conditions inside a can of beans or something is way better than just the ocean or can of peanut butter or whatever.
Things that make you go,
No life has miraculously happened on any grocery store shelf.
wild. We're going to stop right there. Crick is really he's the direct opposite of Kenyon, in my opinion. Kenyon saw what was. Crick saw it and said, no. That's your difference. Next week we'll finish this up. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do after that. We'll see.
There's another problem that they showed in there too. That not only, but if you talk about the equation for will a chemical form, there's no time in that equation. There's no
Right.
time thing. So it's either spontaneous reaction or not. But even if the chemical forms, it's got to be in the right shape.
Yep.
You can have different chemicals that are the same chemical makeup, but if they're not the right shape, and they've had medicine accidents with this, where they've made medicines, but the shape has been one off,
Yep.
even though it's molecularly the same chemical, and they've been like, well, why is the medicine not having any effect? It turns out, the shape is important too. So that bending of the proteins, not only do you have to have that chemical structure, but you've got to have the right shape too,
Yep.
where it's not even.
I thought that's the most interesting thing, because that is such a finely tuned system that's happening inside your body.
Mm-hmm.
And what he talks about, the information that's kept there, you couldn't even, the books that he said that you would have to, that just blows your mind.
Yeah, and I think some of them proteins that if they are the wrong shape, they're actually like poisonous to you.
I don't know about that, but I do know this. If you think about some of the malformities that we have with people, obviously one little glitch can cause a big issue.
And some of those malformities, they don't last very long without
That's right.
specialized care. So,
Yep.
you know, it's like, how did we live with maybe this not being right
Yep.
for any length of time for it to then be self-corrected through this?
Yep.
Billions and billions of years of carnage have just failed.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Good stuff. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, just as your word says. Lord, I thank you for all the different scientists that will argue these points. Stand firm on your word. Lord, I just pray that you would help us to grow in our knowledge. Thank you for Dr. Del Tackett, the work that he's done, work that he's continuing to do. I pray that you bless him. Thank you for our church. Thank you for this wonderful place that we can come together. Lord, we pray that you bless the rest of this evening now in Jesus' name. Amen. And amen.
You know, some of them scientists too, they remind me of, it's like CNN showing the riots, saying, it's all peaceful. It's like everything was on fire.
It's mostly peaceful.
It's mostly peaceful. You know, it's like some of them scientists, it's not, it is by chance, it is by chance.
Well, so now what they've done is they've added the whole multiverse theory to sort of provide like that escape mechanism.